outside the university, but which contributes immensely and substantively to events. We have intentionally kept ourselves at a distance from the university to ensure that there is a level of academic freedom. And that is our commitment, which we continue to uphold in the present circumstances, which are not very conducive. And I think what keeps us going is your presence whenever we organize a lecture or organize an event. That we have so many people coming in a place like Baroda is what keeps us motivated. So I must thank you today for agreeing to come to Baroda and give a talk at the forum. Professor Bilgrami has been a very long friend of the forum. There are few people we can count on perhaps one hand who have contributed to the strength and the sustenance of the Forum on Contemporary Theory, and he would be among the first two. So thank you so much, Akil, if I may use the first name, for your presence here today. I had a wonderful road trip with him yesterday from Ahmedabad. I picked him up from IM, and it was such a pleasant drive getting to Baroda. Looking forward to it throughout the morning yesterday. I also must put on record my sense of appreciation to all of you, but I must mention some. Thank you, Alaknanda Patel, for your presence here today. Thank you, Jignesh Mewani, for your presence here today. It means a lot. Jignesh traveled 5 hours just to be here with us, so thank you so much. I can also see some teachers from Central University of Gujarat. Some have come all the way from Rajkot. Some of us from MS University. I can see Rachna from the Family and Community Sciences. Thank you for your presence here today, and thank you each one of you. I'm not mentioning all names, but thank you so much for your presence here. You haven't come here to listen to me, I know. I'll just take about 2 or 3 minutes to introduce someone who doesn't need an introduction, but protocol demands that we do this, because we need to put on record the contributions and the accomplishments of the speaker. Akil Bilgrami is Sidney Morton Baser Professor of Philosophy and Professor on the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University, New York. Professor Bilgrami earned his BA in English Literature from Elphinstone College, Bombay University, and went on to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, where he read philosophy, politics, and economics. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago. He has been the director of the Heyman Center for the Humanities as well as director of the South Asia Institute at Columbia. He earlier spent 2 years at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Professor Bilgrami has 2 relatively independent sets of intellectual interests: the philosophy of mind and language, and political philosophy and moral psychology. His publications include Belief and Meaning, published by Blackwell in 1992, Self-Knowledge and Resentment, published by Howard University Press, 2006, Secularism, Identity and Enchantment, published by Howard University Press, 2014, Nature and Value, published by Columbia University Press, 2019, and Gandhi's Integrity, published by Columbia in 2020. His forthcoming work is titled, I believe, Politics and the Moral Psychology of Identity, which is to be published by Howard University Press. Professor Bilgrami is also the editor of the books Democratic Culture, Historical and Philosophical Essays, published by Routledge in 2011, Marx, Gandhi and Modernity, published by Columbia University Press in 2014, Who's Afraid of Academic Freedom, and I recommend this book to everyone, published by Columbia University Press in 2016, and Beyond the Secular West, published by Columbia University Press 2016. And I can go on and on about him, but I think I need to hand over the mic to him. Once again, thank you, Akil, for your presence here today, and I invite you to give the first talk of the year on autonomy, norms and truth. Akil.
Thank you very much. Kind words. It's nice to be back with old friends like Kapala, Khan and Tabai and Rajwati, and it's a big thrill for me that Jignesh Vivani is here. I've been following his career ever since 2017, and a great admirer of his. So, except that I feel bad that we were having a very animated discussion on the real world, and I'm going to fly very far from the real world and talk about high philosophy. I'm sorry, I apologize right from the start. I'm going to pose a question which I think we all should ask and try to answer. And that is, how do we see the relationship between the concept of freedom and the concept of truth? On the face of it, it's not obvious that they are closely related. And yet I think it's very important to draw a link between them. One way to think about it, and the first time I began to think about it, was when I began to ask what exactly Gandhi meant by Swaraj. As you know, he wrote a book which is much celebrated but also much criticized in Swaraj. And one of the driving motivations for writing that book was to say that Swaraj is not just getting rid of British colonial rule. So gaining freedom, even though the notion of Swaraj was central to the mobilization for freedom from colonial rule, his claim was getting freedom from colonial rule was absolutely not sufficient for independence of Swaraj. So what else was needed? And his view was, what was needed was to get it right, to have the truth about how to build an independent society in India. And the truth did not lie in retaining, despite getting rid of British colonial rule, retaining the outlooks, the culture that British colonial rule might have left as its legacy if one was not watchful. And so he had an alternative vision of civil society, alternative vision of politics, alternative vision of the state, to which nobody paid attention after independence. And so his idea was there is a link between Swaraj and Satya. He said that explicitly. But he didn't make clear what that is. Now, I don't want to talk about Gandhi for the rest of this essay at all, but I'm saying what prompted me to think about this issue is, what is the connection? Now, the founder of Christianity is supposed to have said, according to the book of St. John, that the truth shall set you free. That's now become a cliche. It's a slogan. So here's my question. How is it that our theories of freedom, which have been central to the political enlightenment, are so distant from this idea that only the truth shall set you free? The theories of freedom of the political enlightenment, there's a chasm between Gandhi's idea that Swaraj is Satya and the truth will set you free, which is an old Christian slogan. If those are cliches, then how comes cliche is a familiar truth. So how come a familiar truth is so distant from our theories of freedom? That's my question. Let me put it another way. Our theories of freedom, of the political enlightenment, reside in the notion of autonomy. And autonomy is the idea of that we are autonomous if we exercise our capacity to choose. That's what makes us autonomous and free, is our capacity to choose how we live, what norms we adopt, what institutions we build, what society we create, that we should choose it. That's self-governance, Swaraj. All right, so if that's the idea, that's what the political enlightenment says, is that we exercise our choice, then there's a chasm to be bridged if you also want to say, as Gandhi did, and as Christ did, that no, it's not sufficient. You're not autonomous or free if you just have the capacity to exercise your choices. You're not free until you make the right choices. That's the problem. That's the issue that I want to discuss. You're not free until you make the right choices. Whereas all of the theories of the Enlightenment say you're free if you can choose. And so there's a huge gap between that and the idea that freedom consists in making the right choices, the truth. Right? So how do we bridge that gap? So to do that, I'm going to give you some of the intellectual history of the Enlightenment and some of the intellectual history that takes you beyond the Enlightenment. And so I'm going to give you my reading of Kant, who's central to the political enlightenment, and then Hegel and Marx, who are the post-Kantian German philosophers who give you the conceptual resources to go from freedom as choice to freedom as the right choices. So I want to give you a reading of the intellectual history so that we can make that bridge that gap. Okay, so let me start with Kant. In his great, profound work, Groundwork to the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant claimed that normativity arises when we raise a certain question about the human nature that we have been endowed with. He says human beings are characterized by what he called human inclinations. By inclinations, he means desires, passions, wants, instincts of that kind. We all have desires, wants. Hume called them passions. So, and Kant said, having desires and wants and passions is empirical psychology, human psychology. These are what nature has given us. And then Kant says, but we don't want to be ruled by our passions, and that is why we have a capacity which he called reason. And he says, reason, practical reason as he called it, is the capacity to ask of any desire or inclination or want, passion that we have, should we act on that passion? Ought we to act on that passion? And as soon as we raise that question and answer it, we have transformed what are hitherto merely empirical facts about our psychology and nature to authorized inclinations or norms. We have authorized our norms when we answer that question. If I say, yes, I ought to acquiesce in my inclination, whatever the inclination might be. If I say I ought to acquiesce in it, it's gone from something which was hitherto merely a feature of empirical psychology to a feature of moral psychology. It has gone from a tendency of nature in us to a norm. That's the idea. The idea is by asking the question, ought I to, should I acquiesce in this, I have converted something which is merely a bit of my nature to a normative ought. And once I do that, we are in the realm of norms, in the realm of moral psychology, and not just empirical psychology. Now, this basic question, which reflects our autonomy, our capacity to choose, ought I to acquiesce in my passions? If I say no, then I construct an alternative norm, and it is also authorized. So this capacity to ask the question, ought I to, about an aspect of our nature, is what makes us creatures of freedom, autonomous rather than heteronomous. That's a phrase. Okay, now central to the political enlightenment was to extend this idea of Kant, that there is a question that our reason allows us to ask, to extend that question and that capacity to ask it, not just to our wants and passions. So that what the political enlightenment did was to extend Kant's idea that the capacity to ask this question, should I or ought I to be based in something that's given to me in my nature, my psychological nature, you can extend it to asking, should I acquiesce in my social conditioning? That was the crucial extension of Kant's understanding of practical reason that the Enlightenment made. And so it became a much more interesting phenomenon which could be this central idea of the political Enlightenment, which is that we can extend Kant's insight about the nature of autonomy, which comes from our reason, i.e., the capacity to answer this question, to not just to our passions and wants and desires, but to what we are socially conditioned at. All of us, unless we are Robinson Crusoe, all of us are brought up in some social setting. It's a family, it's a neighborhood, it's a community, it's a caste, it's a religion, it's a nation, whatever it might be. You're all brought up, unless you're Robinson Crusoe, We are all brought up in some social setting which conditions us into its norms. My mother would constantly tell me, please don't do that. Pilgrims don't do that. It was just a standard mantra with her. Just conditioning me into behaving as the Pilgrims do. And this current, the extension of current consists of asking. At some stage, I became awakened into Kantian practical reason, and I was able to ask. Actually, I was very irritated with my mother, I think around the age of 11 or 12, then I was able to ask, should I be doing what the Barodas are doing? And that's the onset of reason for Kant. The onset of practical reason is to be able to ask that. And it doesn't have to be just family, it could be society. And you know, it's not always easy to ask it and answer it and get away with it, right? If you're being conditioned into norms by some elders of a caste panchayat, it's not easy to just say, no, I should not be doing what I'm doing. And I dare say it wasn't easy for me to say that with my mother and the Barodas. So it's not easy. Kantian autonomy is not easily achieved. But nevertheless, the Kant's point was, it's a matter of rationality or reason, because what you're really asking is, do I have reason to do what the Barodas are doing? And that's what he means by the capacity for reason reflecting our capacity for freedom or autonomy. And this is the heart of the Enlightenment. I think it's the basic grounding for the rights around freedom, whether it's the right to free speech, the right to worship, the right to even privacy. All these things derive from this Kantian idea of autonomy, to be able to ask this question, ought I, should I, etc., of one's social condition. Okay, so this is the beginnings of the foundations, the grounding of the central core of the political enlightenment. Now, what Hegel did was to ask a question that doesn't give up on Kant's idea of autonomy, as I've expounded it so far, but modifies it in a very radical direction. What Hegel says is fine. What Kant is saying is perfectly correct. Our autonomy consists in being able to ask that question of our social condition. But Hegel says there's a further question, which is, when we raise Kant's question, do I have reason to be doing what my social condition, whatever the social is, family or caste or religion or whatever, when I ask that question, what conceptual and normative resources do I have to appeal to in answering the question? What do I turn to? What do I rely on? What do I appeal to? What conceptual resources do I appeal to answer that question? Hegel said, Kant never really gave a proper elaboration as it should be given to this further question. What are the resources we have to answer the question? And Hegel's modification of Kant was to say, we have no conceptual resources to answer it, except the resources given to us by our social condition. We can't go off to Mars. There's no Archimedean transcendent place to go to. We are in our social condition. So when we ask of any particular bit of social conditioning, ought I to acquiesce in it, and I can answer yes or no, thereby authorizing it or deauthorizing it. Hegel said, in answering it, I have the resources to appeal to, but my social condition. So the idea is, that we are, each person is in the social condition, and we ask of any particular element, ought I to? And in order to answer it, I don't go off somewhere transcendent. I can only answer it from somewhere else within this. Where else do I go? Now, I'm drawing this point in Hegel from his way of putting it. His way of putting it is more diachronic, and I'm putting it in a more synchronic way. His way of putting it is more temporally. He says we are in social history, and in our social context, contradictions emerge. And we, through deliberation, move on to the next phase by resolving the contradictions. Well, that's his dialectical or diachronic way of putting it. I'm putting it more synchronically, because that's how it emerged. I'm taking this idea of internal contradictions in our social context to say, within our social context, one part asks this question, and if we say no to the question, we are saying no from another part of the social, from the point of view of another part of it. And that would be the internal contradiction that Hegel is talking about. So this is my synchronic way of putting Hegel's dialectical diagram. Okay? So that's the idea. That's the modification. That Hegel, he accepts the autonomy and reason question. You see, I mean, you've got to understand that there's no doubt that animal rights theorists, environmental rights theorists might find this objectionable, but there's no doubt that Kant thought of reason as uniquely human. And it's fine to say that dogs have reason and wolves have reason. After all, if a wolf flees from a predator, you can say it had reason to flee from a predator. So that's fine, but it doesn't have reason in the following sense. A wolf does not ask of its pack, should I be doing what my pack is conditioned to do? Only we, as far as we know, only human beings have the capacity to ask that. A wolf cannot ask that of its pack. So, but what Hegel insists on is we have no resources to answer the autonomy reflecting question, except within the social conditioning we've been brought up on. Okay, so that's the first twist that Hegel gives. And now, see that, we are moving out of the Enlightenment. And here is how we can begin to connect the idea. Hegel, by saying this, gives us the resources to see how freedom might be connected to assessments of truth and falsity. Think of it this way. If it is true, if Hegel is right, that we can, the resources, the conceptual and normative resources we have for answering the autonomy reflecting question is just more norms and beliefs and values that we've been socially conditioned into. Then it may be possible that we give the wrong answer to the question, do I have reason to do what my social condition is? If the answer I give to that question turns on appealing to values and norms which have been socially conditioned into, right? Some place in the social context, raising a question about something and other things. It could be that their understanding and the conceptual resources I appeal to are just the prejudices of my community. Right? So just look at it. If I'm asking this question about this aspect of my social condition and appealing to some other aspect of my social condition which just reflect my community's prejudices, casteist prejudices, let's say. So what I appeal to here, let's say, is some racial prejudice or casteist prejudice or something in order to answer this question. Well, in that case, I've given the wrong answer. So how am I free? If the answer I give merely reflects further prejudices of my social condition, which might be casteist, racist, whatever. No, just the kind of social condition that is everywhere going on in this country, in our country. This is just the prejudices of political ideology. That's what we've been conditioned into. Then any question we ask about any particular thing, if it merely reflects that kind of prejudice, how are we free? That's the question. And the Enlightenment doesn't allow you to say that, because the Enlightenment doesn't raise Hegel's point that it's only within our social conditioning that we ask this question. So the Enlightenment seems to think if you can choose and ask this question and answer it, you've got freedom. And what Hegel allows you to say is, no, if your answer turns on things which are just another part of your social conditioning, if that part of your social conditioning happens to be just the prejudices of your community, you aren't free. It's not enough to just ask the question. It's not sufficient. Alright, so we come to a point where we say that you can have the illusion of freedom. You think you're free because you ask that question and answer it. But your answer, if it appeals to things like, which are just the prejudices of your community, only gives you the appearance or illusion of freedom. And the whole Enlightenment tradition finds this idea dangerous. The whole Enlightenment tradition wants to stop where Kant left us. I say, you're able to ask that question, you're autonomous. Right? There's no scope within the Enlightenment for saying an illusion of freedom, just because in some answers you give. It's not enough to be able to ask it. You can answer wrongly, and in that case, you're under the illusion of that. There's no scope. Isaiah Berlin's whole point is anxiety about confidence was precisely that. You don't want to be told there can be illusions of freedom. Because then somebody will say, the truth belongs to Marx, the truth belongs to this, and then you're off and running where some Leninist vanguard has the right truth. And that fills the liberal Enlightenment figure like Isaiah Berlin with anxiety. Isaiah Berlin was a Cold War figure, basically. His careless masterpiece, Two Concepts of Liberty, was precisely driven by Cold War anxiety. He was a refugee of the Russian Revolution. And so you can see why this was driving him. This anxiety was driving him. Okay, so that's the deep issue that we're confronted with. And there are very fascinating things that follow. Once you see Hegel as giving you the wherewithal to make the claim that you can have genuine freedom or be under the impression of having freedom, but an illusory freedom. Once that distinction enters the idea of liberty or freedom, we are in much more interesting terrain, and we are busting out of the seams of the Enlightenment's liberty framework. Now, I want to draw some of the implications, if this reading is right, then of the intellectual history is right, here are the interesting implications of some of what I've been saying, forenorms and autonomy. If questions of truth, of illusion, truth, of falsity are now in play. You see, it's when one gets it right and is not under an illusion, one's choices, one's thoughts, one's reason sees the world correctly. Sees the world right. So you have to ask, well, how do we know when we've got it right and when we are under the illusion of freedom? How can we tell? Is there some criteria by which we can tell? There's no criteria. There's no rule book. And this is the difference between social and political philosophy and formal philosophy. You see, in formal philosophy, reason is driven by rule books. So if you have something like deductive rationality, formal rationality, rational logic, etc., they have strict rules which yield validity. So from Aristotle to Frege, you have formalized rules which tell you what reason is. So take deduction, take the standard rationality of deduction. We have a syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. Now, if that is what reason is, this kind of rules of deduction, you can substitute for mortal immortal. Or when are immortal, Socrates is alone, Socrates is immortal. So you can get anything, you can substitute anything for the opposite of mortal, immortal, and you still get a truth. If all men are mortal and Socrates is man, then it is true that Socrates is immortal. If all men are immortal and Socrates is man, it's true that Socrates is immortal. So it is, the more rule-bound you are, the more empty you are. You get manifestly false things, like Socrates is immortal coming off as true. That's what it means to say reason is empty or insubstantial. But when you do social and political philosophy, it's not like that. There are no rules. So if somebody says, how do I, is there some rule? Is there some criteria by which I can tell that I've got it right and I'm not under an illusion of freedom? So, you see, Kant has not gone away. What it means is the reflective vigilance of the Kantian question has to keep repeating itself. You have to ask at every place, constantly, when you give answers. There's no getting away from that reflective vigilance of asking the Kantian question. So Kant has not gone away. It's just that you have the socialization and historicization of Kant that comes with Hegel and Marx. And we've got remarkable different answers to what is illusory and what is not. And one of the things that I want to, which I find very fascinating, is that when you get it right, whatever the right might be, when you get it right, the subject transparently sees the world. And there's nothing else to be done. There's no need to explain it. No explanation is called for. You just get it right. Let me give you an analogy. Suppose I veridically see this bottle of water. Just take perception. I just see this bottle of water. Now, if I really see this bottle of water, if it's true, that there's a bottle of water, essentially true, there's no need for any explanation. It's just true. But suppose I'm under the illusion that there's a bottle of water. Now, you have to posit an explanation. It calls for an explanation. And you have to say things like, well, there was some illusion, there was an appearance of it. You have to introduce vocabulary like appearances, seemings, etc. Right? To account for the fact that I failed to see it. Well, falsity rather than illusion. See. So something is called for. And of course, if I fail to get it right in the social and political realm, then something is called for to explain how come I've gotten it wrong. And Marx gave a very deep and elaborate answer of what happens when you get it wrong. That was his notion of ideology. Karl Marx's notion of ideology is precisely the idea that you're under an illusion of freedom. Because in the grip of ideology, you haven't gone and seen, so you introduce notions of ideology only when you have it wrong. And it's quite, it may very well be the case that Marx is right, that getting it wrong is a waste. It could be 250, 300 years of social and economic history since the rise of the capitalist economic formation. We are, if Marx is right, under an illusion. We are under the illusion of freedom. So it's a very fascinating thing that no explanation is called for, such as positive appearances, seemings, ideology in the larger social and political camps. There's no explanation called for if you've got it right. If you've got it right, the world is transparent. Ideology is a screening from the reaching out to the world, just as a perception. So the question arises, what is it that allows you to see the norms? Now, how much should I? So I want to now give you some structure for what it is to perceive the norms right. And there are a whole range of issues here which have emerged, which are since Marx, which I'm much more wary of, but still I think one should say a little bit about them. And that is that with philosophers like Bourdieu and Foucault, who acknowledge all this in Marx, they nevertheless argue that we, I'm trying to think of the clearest way to put this. See, there's after the rise of, in the 20th century, in response to a range of philosophical positions, which I won't try and expound into, which are known as structuralists, as figures like sociolinguistics, but chiefly Althusser and Marx, in Marxism. A post-structuralist tendency arose, which argued, so let's take two the most interesting figures of structuralism, and who I think are Bourdieu and Foucault, who argued that practices are primary, and practices, if there's any freedom, it's within practices. So it isn't, so truth, whatever truth there is within a practice. Whereas Marx's idea was that with capitalism, with the emergence of the certain economic formation, there was a distortion, a screening, an illusion of freedom, and he thought the nature of capital was more or less universal, and you overcame the constraints that capital imposed, the restrictions, constrainings of capital in overcoming the illusion of freedom and gain authentic freedom. Bourdieu claimed that sounds, that for them it was too universal. and that there are particular practices within which autonomy is possible and within which truth is possible. And Foucault actually, in addition to the earlier idea, is to say that the disciplines are so deep and strict that it's not even obvious what the notion of autonomy is even there. But nevertheless, there are practices within which, if there's any scope, which you find Foucault skeptical of, but Bourdieu allows it, autonomy and truth to be within practices. So now the question arises, how do truths, autonomy and so on, within a practice relates to truth and autonomy in another practice? Are there just multiple truths insulated from each other? Now, when you take a broadly Marxist position, you can't accept that. So this is still a contested and confusing and unclear ground of disputation. But let me end by giving you what I think is a way to think about the issues involved here. The idea that if I'm in a practice, it's my truth, and another person in another practice is just got another truth, suggests that apprehensions of truth cannot speak to one another, cannot learn from one another. They're inferentially insulated from one another. And that suggests that you have to speak of local truths, of truths relativized to practices. Now, I don't understand that. I don't understand that thing. Why? Because to say that truth is relativized to my practice, I have to stand outside the practice. If I say, this truth is relative to my practice, where am I standing? Somewhere outside the practice. There's no place. Until there's no place outside the practice. So what does it mean to say, my truth is relative to my practice, is local to my practice? I can't say what Bourdieu is telling me to say. Because by Bourdieu's lines, I can't stand outside of my practice. But then I can't say it's relative to my practice. So truth is just truth. Of course, I judge truth from within my practice. But that doesn't mean truth is local or relative to my practice. It's not a sayable thing. So if you take the Hegelian view that you can't fly off to Mars or to some transcendent Archimedean position, you can't claim that truth is relative or local. So at the same time as the Hegelian position denies universalism, saying it's all within the social practice, also denies parochialism and insularity. And relativism. If you properly understand what Hegel and Marx brought to account, you can't take the module for granted. Because the anti-Archimedeanism, the anti-transcendental philosophy, at the same time, with the same idea, cancels both universalism and relativism, localism. And that's just how it should be. It seems to me ethically right that even if I judge truth from within my practice, it's not. Another's truth is not something that I can never learn something from, and vice versa. So what I'm clearly is that what Hegel wrote for Kant cancels a kind of insularity at the same time as it says everything is within a social practice condition. Another way of putting it is that what Hegel and Marx do is allow for, because they have a dialectical and historical angle on these issues around truth and autonomy, which Baroda and Foucault don't. They don't have a dialectical point of view. So, but let's work with an example. I remember writing after the Salman Rushdie controversy, after the satanic verses. Issues came up about the practices of Islam, which involved censorship and blasphemy, and so on, and the practices of the Enlightenment. And it's perfectly plausible that at the time they were simply not speaking to each other. Nobody was learning from the other. It just seemed true. They were just not learning from each other, not prepared to learn from each other. So there did seem to be an insularity. Now, if you take the Hegelian line, which Marx had developed about materialist lines, of a dialectical conception of truth and autonomy. So here's a way of thinking of it. So if you have two practices, and you have truth and autonomy in each, and they're not speaking to each other, this person's truth is not speaking to this, vice versa. It doesn't have to be Islam. Political environment and other practices. It's just what came to mind. What I think can be argued, if Hegel and Marx are right about these dialectical possibilities of history, is that this and this amount to an impasse only if this is completely consistent and has no contradictions, and if this is completely consistent and has no contradictions. Right? So if I believe in some proposition P, censorship, blasphemy, etc., and you believe in free speech or something, those are just examples. You can substitute anything for this. So if I have a certain value of belief, and you have another, which is, let's say, inconsistent with it, or at least potentially, and each is perfectly consistent, then there's no, it's an impasse. You can't speak to each other. But we are not monsters. What Hegel and Marx are saying is we are not monsters of consistency and goodness. History always injects conflicts within a practice, social practice. History. So it's not static. That's what I mean by dialectic. At any given time, this may not speak to this because each is perfectly, but history may introduce conflicts within one or the other, which then this can begin to lean on the contradiction and say, well, maybe given your contradiction, you should come around to this. So history introduces contradictions in one or the other, which then the other, so suppose a contradiction emerges here. Now this person, this group, this practice has the capacity to unsettle the practices here, with which there's dispute or disagreement. So history, if history can introduce contradictions, that's the Hegel Marx trajectory, addition to modification of then it's possible that one can begin to learn from each other. So what Marx and Hegel are saying is that this is an unnecessarily complicated way of putting it. I think if you wanted to say it rigorously, this is the right way to put it. What Hegel and Marx are saying is it's necessary that it's possible that contradictions will emerge and the seeming impasse will be overcome. It's necessary that it's possible. Think of it, it's an iterative modality. It's necessary, according to Hegel and Marx's idea of a dialectic understanding of society and history. It's necessary that it's possible that contradictions will emerge and a seeming impasse will be overcome. And I think Bourdieu and Foucault have a much bleaker view because they don't have this historical dialectical idea. They will insist on a different iterative modality, which is only possible that it's possible that contradictions will emerge. Whereas Marx and Hegel have a deep commitment, which is necessary that it's possible. So I leave it as a homework exercise for you, which is the preferred iterative modality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm sure that said most of us, if not all of us, think. The lecture is now open for comments, questions.
I don't, this is very new concept for me, the idea of autonomy. But as you said about the freedom, that absolute freedom, rejecting the norms in individual life or in political life. So does it brings the alienation after that? The idea of this is my freedom if I reject those norms. And does it create the state after that alienation, an ex nihilo state or an existential angst? And does it bring us to whether suicide or the dictatorship or murder or rapes? Does it create a state of no rule or anarchy?
Well, I think the notion of alienation is a very central notion to all this. And in fact, that's what I think brings Gandhi and Marx closer together. They both believed in the unalienated idea. And it's quite possible that they were too idealistic about that. In fact, I've always thought that if you look at the dispute between Gandhi and Ambedkar on versus just a realism about what in fact practices and social conditions and social groups with their own practices made possible. See, because I really think that the idealism, the runaway idealism in Gandhi was that, you know, if you're unalienated, even caste leaders or caste leaders would vote, you know, for the Dalit candidate who would do the best for the West off Dalits, and not vote for some Dalit candidate who sold out to, I don't know, I think the details were that Dalits would choose a list of four, and then you would, and you know, if you had a list of four, you would have somebody who was a total sellout, and then why would upper castes not vote for the sellout? And I think Gandhi's idealism was that if you're unalienated, you do what's in the interest of the West off. And I think everybody from Ambedkar to Ramsey MacDonald walked with you don't do that. You are alienated. You're stuck with alienation. You can wait for a classless society or whatever it is to overcome alienation, or you can wait for some moral revolution that Gandhi has in mind. But you know, so that's a matter of realism. I mean, the overcoming of alienation is a very large idea, and it turns on institutions, it turns on particular historical circumstances, and on that I think Gandhi was pretty idealistic. I don't think he was a Brahmanical hypocrite, as Betty Anderson and Aaron said. I don't think so, but I do think that he just had it completely wrong. Yeah.
Jeannie Sharp notes in his book Gandhi Wields the Power of Moral Weapon that there is something godlike in men, and in the end the good and the godlike will prevail together. This is the quote which was being written by Jeannie Sharp. So my question is that why we are not able to prevail? Why good and godlike is not able to prevail?
Human beings are shit. I'm very old-fashioned on this. I don't believe. So I believe in rights. I believe people have to be made to do things and not do things. We're not godlike. We need rights to prevent us from doing things and made to do things. I don't think there should be many rights, but they should be in the Constitution. They should be the core of the Constitution. They can only be overturned by forming another constituent assembly. Nothing short of that to overturn. And there should be very few rights. You have the rights to autonomy, sure. And you have economic rights. Basic food, shelter, education, employment. In the Constitution, so that you are forced to do whatever it takes to implement them. They're justiciable, not only justiciable, you've tied yourself to the mast of them. You see, we human beings are shits, and so you have to come up with with something which is not just a policy devised by a cabinet, it should be in the Constitution so that it cannot be overturned. You know, have you read Ulysses, Homer's Odyssey? So it's like that. When you have something which is a real right, economic rights and so on, what you do is, see, what happened to Ulysses? Ulysses knew that he would be seduced by the Sirens in his Eclipse of Wanderings. He would be seduced by the song of the Sirens. So what does he do? He ties himself to the mast. So that even when he's seduced, he can't act on it. That's what rights are. They're like Ulysses and the Sirens' commitments. You tie yourself to the mast so that but it's obvious in the case of freedom of speech. But not now, not with this third-rate regime we've been living in the last 10 years where, it's all gone. But what is it to have, say, the right to freedom of speech? To have it is that if tomorrow, so let's take the case, if tomorrow I wanted to censor a fascist like Narendra Modi, if I wanted to censure him, I would not be allowed to do so. Because I've tied myself to the mast with free speech as a right. I tell you, every bone in my body says, censor him, jail him. Right? And maybe jail him for 2002, sure, yeah, that's a crime. But just for saying things which are something I despise, disapprove of, can't censor him. I've tied myself to the mast with free speech. That's what it is to have a right. Even if I'm seduced and weakened and want to censor somebody who's a fascist, I can't be allowed to do so. The same should be done with economic rights. If you do that, you're forced to put constraints on globalization. You're forced to put constraints on capital flight. So that if you put the constraints on capital, what does it take to have economic rights? 2% on wealth tax. We've figured it out. Balvant Parekh, a committee formed by a bunch of people in Delhi, we said, I was involved from the periphery of this. It takes 2% of wealth tax and 30% on inheritance tax. What the provisions that go into wealth. That's it. If you did that, you could literally set up this regime of economic rights. That's not a very big deal. To say it's too utopian is as I was telling I joined this morning, it's literally to see a molehill as a mountain. Now, of course, capital will insist that you see it that way. You don't have to see it. Why isn't the India clock generating and constructing a national discourse that educates the public? This is not a big deal. You can do it. You don't have to be bullied by the Adanis and Ambanis or the Narendra Modis this is not a 2% tax. What is that? So it's perfectly possible to create a national discourse if you have the will to do it and you have the ability to do it. Hire a public relations so you don't have to go to godlikeness. These are the issues before us. We are human beings. We don't have godlike images which we follow. And we have to tie ourselves to the mast because we're not godlike.
Thank you, Professor Grammy, for this wonderful lecture. I was just wondering, can we explore continuity of Kant in Gandhi in a different way? Continuity of Kant in Gandhi, in a sense that truth is a priority for Gandhi, in a sense that truth is non-violence. If truth is not non-violent, then it is not truth. So rather than rupture with Kant, there is a part continuity of Kantian truth in Gandhi.
Yeah, I agree. You see, but Gandhi was more interesting on this question than Kant, because Gandhi did have very novel ideas of governance, which were never. I mean, they were never implemented for any number of reasons. For one thing, we just inherited the civil service from the British. The IS is just the ICS with a different face. And so the governance came, all the bureaucracy, the centralization, and so on and so forth. And then Nehru had two answers. One was, if you have Gandhian ideas of governance which are highly decentralized, federalized, decentralized, regional, municipal, almost, was his idea of governance. He thought you could never get rid of the princes. If you had that much local decentralized regional autonomy, you'd never get rid of the princes. You need centralization. And you know that. If you look at the police action by the Baroda, you look at what Patel did at Goa, you need that. So that's what one view of. So that meant a centralized state, which a centralized state is basically going to be a violent form of government. It's just that's where it isn't participatory. We just create it. You know this from Soviet Russia, And the other thing was that he was committed to central planning. So once you had the non-notice, and this was not supposed to be friends. Look at the history of it. In 1938, Subhash Bose set up the National Planning Committee. Jawaharlal was its chair. Kumarappa was there. They laughed at Kumarappa. They disdained him. I mean, they treated him like a Jew. Just read the proceedings. We had these plans of the Soviet style industrialized central plan. None of this was there. None was there. In 1938, that's 9 years before independence. That was the future. So Gandhi's ideas of non-violence, governance, and so on were completely sidelined as early as the late 1950s.
Two questions. One.
Sir, this might sound silly, but then I have a very basic question. How to evaluate whether the answer is right or wrong?
How to evaluate?
Answer is right or
How
wrong.
to evaluate whether the answer is right or not?
So, in context of, we might give a wrong answer if we have no resources except the ones given by our social condition. So, how do we know whether the answer is right or wrong?
Actually, sir, related to him, I have also similar kind of question, but in a different framework. Sir, as you told that Hegel's modification somehow cancels the Kantian notion of autonomy. My question is,
Not cancels it, but modifies it.
modifies and the modification somehow ruptures that thing, the absoluteness of his autonomy or
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
But it's nevertheless, you have to keep that reflective vigilance, and that's a Kantian idea.
But is that reflective vigilance is the only option, or like we can go on like, or some people even can say that let's just maintain the status quo because we cannot know the truth, because knowledge itself is a construct, some kind of construct. We are always knowing something from a vantage point, and which is somehow also a part of social conditioning. And so, in a way, either we go back to the Platonic essences or we are doomed in a way.
You certainly shouldn't go back to Platonic essence, right? But it doesn't mean that you can't form commitments. You see, it makes, I think it's literally incoherent to say that one shouldn't form commitments because one's past commitments have been formed. That's an incoherent idea. But that's what you're suggesting. You see, what you're suggesting is, since our past commitments have been formed, we should be skeptical of making commitments. But that makes no sense as a methodology. Because even to say that our past commitments are false means taking your present commitments to be true. Because it's from the point of view of your present commitments that your past commitments are false. So it doesn't make sense to say, I should lack confidence in my present commitments, because then I can't give you the premise. So there's no escaping the fact that you make commitments to the truth. You've got a liberal instinct there. I'm not a liberal.
Would you like to respond to the question, or how do you know he's right?
How will Einstein know this right? This is not a problem for political philosophy, it's a problem for natural science. It's a problem for everything. Are you going to say that you're not going to believe in physics? Are you going to say, no, you're confident that the world is not flat? So don't pretend that you don't know what the truth is.
It's the truth. Why do we need belief?
There's no rule book for it. I mean, I can't give you a criteria. Right? That's why Kant doesn't go away despite the quantification. Because you have to be vigilant, you have to be reflectively vigilant, but that doesn't mean you don't make commitments. And if that's true of natural science, why on earth would it not be true of politics?
But sir, many scientific truths are
Actually, there's some people waiting for questions.
Good afternoon, sir. Building on the questions of my peers, I was thinking that, gods are gods because they don't need to survive. Gods are gods because they don't need to survive. The people,
Just tell them they don't need to survive.
yeah, because when we say that humans are shits, why is it that? In what perspective? Because I feel that truth is the domain of the gods and we should not go there. But what we can do is, through our lived experiences, we can try to approach the truth. Like in scientific communities also, let's say the theory of heliocentricity or any new invention that comes that is a bit radical. The running joke is that nobody will believe you, everyone will ostracize you because it contravenes the pre-existing notions. So truth is being created in real time by us. So on that, it is being created in real time as well as it is being created by our social conditions. So coming to the humanities aspect, I was wondering that you spoke of Kant and Hegel. So when I look at the quotes of Kant, I'm like, wow, what a nice writer, excellent quotes and all that. But then I looked into the historical context of it, and his truths were shaped by the humanist thinking that led to the French Revolution, led to this intellectual renaissance. In the Northern Renaissance, we are seeing Hobbes, who wrote this human life without the state, is short, brutish and nasty. So I wondered why is there so much different difference of experience. So there, he wrote it in the context of the Glorious Revolution. So again, his social, political surroundings were shaping his truths and his thinking. Similarly, when I think of Gandhi, I mean, I should not say this here, but I question myself, why did Gandhi, when he was growing up, he was a prince, he was a son, a child of a good, well-to-do family. There were many slaves, there were many Harijans, but he never raised a voice, he didn't do anything. He thought it was natural. And when he went to the South Africa and he was treated the same way a Harijan was treated in India, there his mind opened and said, this is not right. So the truth of Gandhi that we espouse, is it not a reflection of his lived experiences? If Gandhi had never gone to South Africa, did I say South America? Pardon, South Africa. Yeah, so that, then this sense of Gandhism would never have arisen. So similarly, sir,
Please come to the question, please.
yeah, sir, just we are seeing that there is a change of state going on in Venezuela. So a lot of intellectuals and left-wing thinkers are saying it is very unconstitutional, it is wrong. But the truth is also that many people are suffering under the Maduro regime. So when leftist people say that...
Please come to the question. I'm feeling that we have a question.
yeah, so like my question was basically that if we are saying that others' experiences are wrong in a way, let's say the right-wing experience or something that is there, so they grow up in their social surrounding. So are we not being fascists ourselves?
It's absolutely. It's absolutely. Sounds is. They said it of Chavez, forget about Maduro. They said it of Chavez, he was a thug, he said. They said it of Fidel, he was a thug. But what is, so okay, so Fidel didn't have a free press. True. Because that makes him a thug. You've got this juggernaut breathing down your neck. You have these creeps in Miami who would take over the freedom of the press and topple him within 3 months. And he's going to have a free press. His authoritarianism is not in some vacuum. It's in the context of a brutal power breathing down his neck. Do you know how many times the State Department tried to assassinate him? 9 times. He was called 9 Lives Fidel. Why? Because the State Department made 9 assassination attempts. And he's going to have a free press. Just look at the people in Miami. They were waiting. They were waiting to produce the propaganda that would top of it. This is what Venezuela, this is what Cuba has delivered. It's not in a vacuum. Their authoritarianism is not something that you look at without looking at the political context, the geopolitical context.
But
Last
just
question.
last
No,
statement.
I think we're moving for tea. We can take the last question later.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Balvant, for this lecture. My question is regarding understanding this trajectory of thought. I was thinking, the way you talked about, like, I ought to ask the question, and that has to be done within the framework that is being provided to me, which we call social conditioning. So I was thinking, with regard to Cervantes' text Don Quixote, So Quixote, I would.
Don Quixote.
Don Quixote.
Don Quixote.
Yes. So Don Quixote, like, because he's read a lot and everyone knows that he looks at windmill and he thinks of it as monster and he gives away his life to that idea of it being a monster. So now what I'm trying to understand is that, is it that he reads windmill as monster, that is his ability to read this as social conditioning, or his inability to see windmill as windmill? Is that a social conditioning?
I'm that's very interesting. You see, I think what one has to introduce here to understand the scenario that's the source of your question is seeing something as something. It's not clear how much that wasn't intended as a metaphor. See, I don't think that it isn't exactly an illusion, right? It's a metaphor for how to navigate the relations between optimism and pessimism and things like that. So literature makes it a very different kind of I think reason functions very differently when we try to understand literature and art. It works with metaphors, it works with analogies. It isn't. You see, when you have something like that, an extended metaphorical idea of how windmills were seen by this protagonist. One of the things we have to understand is that we can't bring to the interpretation of something like that in literary, something we figured out in reason and logos and so on, because literature. Think of it this way. Suppose I were to give an example in a sociology textbook, or political science textbook, psychology textbook. That's not literature. That's illustration of something that's been thought out in the realm of logos, in the realm of discursive reason. But literature is not discursive reason. Right? So what's the difference between Don Quixote, the novel, and the kind of thing we're describing in the novel? What's the difference between that and some illustration in a sociology or political science text? In the latter, you figured out the thing in the realm of reason and logos and so on, what Derrida called logocentric reason. You figured it out there, and then this is just an illustration of it. Whereas in literature, the figuring out is done by its own resources. It's not done by reason in the social science and philosopher's sense. It's done by the resources of art, of literature, and so on, which is so I think you can't read it in the way you're trying to press on me with your question.
Because Quixote knows that he is a character in a novel, so he somewhere also participates in this discursive nature of literature. He knows that he's a character, he knows that he's a novel. So it's a literature on literature.
That's not how it is. That's the Borges reading of it. It's not really how I think there isn't that kind of double self-consciousness in the literary character. Of course, if you're a Borges, you would want to read it that way, but it's not.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure there are more questions which we can continue during tea. Thank you very much, Professor Biryani, for what I think was a brilliant talk. Participation here today, and we hope you continue to visit Baroda and the Forum on Contemporary Theories. Thank you all, and please join for a cup of tea in the terrace of the center. Thank you very much.